Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our Microsoft Dynamics GP webinar this afternoon. This has certainly proven to be a very popular webinar topic. We have a number of attendees registered for today's session, which is fantastic. So there's obviously a lot of excitement out there in our GP world for the workflow functionality that's only come in recent releases of GP. So we'll take you through some of that functionality today. So my name is Michael. I'm from Professional Advantage and I'll be your facilitator today. But before we get started, I have a couple of little housekeeping type logistic pieces of info to share with you. So firstly, we will be able to handle questions for you during this presentation today. While we have a number of attendees, you will be able to ask questions, and we will allow some time at the end of the session to take those questions. On the right-hand side of your webinar panel, there is a questions page. You can actually put your questions straight into there, and we will get to those at the end of the session. We will be recording the session today as well, so while you're more than welcome to take as many notes as you like, you don't have to remember or copy down everything. We will record the session and we will share that recording with you at the end of the presentation. So as part of the follow-up to the session, you will receive a link to the recording of the session. So that'll allow you to either re-watch yourself or share with someone else within your organisation in case they want to have a look at that content as well. So as I mentioned, this is a very popular topic, to say the least. We have a large number of attendees on today's session, which is great. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Melita, who will take us through the functionality of workflow. Melita is one of our senior consultants with GP, senior by way of experience that is, so has worked with GP for a number of years. And working specifically now within the newer functionality in workflow. So I'll hand over to Melita to take us through the presentation today. Thanks, Melita.
Okay, as Michael said, welcome. So today I'll just be going through workflow and what that means. So workflow is available in the following areas, and depending upon what version you're on, depends what functionality is available. So we've got General Ledger Batch Approval, Receivables Batch Approval, Payables Batch Approval, Payables Transaction Approval, Purchase Order Approval, Purchase Requisition Approval, Creditor Approval. There are some timesheet approvals as well if you're on project as well. So you'll notice on this document here I've mentioned the versions that these are applicable to. So in GP 2013 R2 was when the release actually started, and with that we had the beginning of purchase requisitions and then purchase order approval. And then with GP 2015 and 2015 R2 there were incremental releases. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just actually go through into Dynamics GP and demonstrate a bit about workflow and how that relates to organisations. So if I open the workflow maintenance area, this is where we need to set up our workflow. And as I illustrated before, there are many areas within workflow. So we've got our General Ledger Batch Approval, within Sales Receivables Batch Approval. For today's purposes, I'm going to illustrate two different approvals. I'm going to go through the vendor approval, and I'll also touch on our payables transaction approval. So when we come to set up workflow, we need to come into the workflow maintenance screen and begin our setup. Okay, so here we've got our vendor approval, and if you notice under here, I've actually got two different workflows. I've called one 2 conditions, and I've called another one vendor approval. Now, the one with the tick is the actual one that is activated. So you can create a number of different workflows, but you can only have one activated at a time. So I've only got my one call, two conditions activated at the moment. So if I go into vendor approval and I have a look at my workflow that's activated, the reason I called it two conditions was there are two conditions or two steps that relate to this workflow. So a workflow has a name and a description, and it obviously relates to the series and the type of workflow. So if you notice, I've got it in the purchasing series and I've got it under vendor approval. I've marked it active and I've got two steps. One step is if a city has A, and these are very simplistic examples, and I've also got what's called a final approver. So with my workflow, in addition to steps, I've also got some options and some timing of tasks. Okay, so my first option is how do I want to send my notifications if the action is complete. So do we want to notify the originator on any of these particular actions? So should the originator be notified when it's approved, when it's rejected, when it's delegated, all those sorts of things. So you can tick any of these boxes and have a workflow message appear to the originator. You can also send carbon copies to additional people. So you're not limited to just the originator. Next we've got, would you like the approver to be able to delegate tasks? The originator, would you like the originator to be an approver? In some instances, the person that processed the transaction, you may not want them to be able to approve a transaction as well. We can select that we always require at least one approver, and we can also use alternate final approver as well. What I'm going to do is go into the steps that I've created, and you can create as many steps as you want within here just by simply creating the new step button. Now I've already started, this is activated, so once the workflow is activated, you can't actually alter it. So you need to deactivate it, change it, and then you can activate again, or create a whole new one and change the activation from this one to your new one. So what I'm going to do is just explain what steps I've created. If I go into this step here, sorry, my step I called if the city has A. So all I'm saying is that where the vendor master city contains the letter A, I want Charlie Carson to receive an email and he must approve it. Now, I've done this very simplistically. I just wanted to illustrate how we can do different steps. The different criteria that we've got available, because we're doing vendor approval or creditor approval, the fields that are often available to put your criteria are the fields available that relate to that task. So we're doing creditor approval, so it would make sense that we're seeing relevant details that are attached to the creditor master record. Okay? So that's my first action. My next action I've got is the final approval. And I'm saying that this is always a required step and that I've got the administrator approving that as well. So what I'm going to do now is just illustrate how this approval will work. So if I were to create a creditor, and I'll create a creditor called workflow, doesn't really matter what details I'm putting on this, but I'm going to create this creditor and I'm going to put an A within the city. And I'm doing that to illustrate how this will go to two different approvers. By clicking the submit button here, I'm going to submit this workflow to Charlie and also the administrator. So I can send them a comment in the email, and I could put this creditor relates to vehicle purchase, for argument's sake, and I can submit it. If I were to go and look that creditor up, you'll notice that it's got pending approval there. If we come into the view the history, it's telling me that these tasks have not been approved. It's been submitted, but these are pending by these users. Okay? So if we go into our email, and I'm using an image, so there's some simplicity in what I'm showing you here. I've actually got administrator's email address here, and I've got Charlie's email address. So there's Charlie's email. Notice my note, this creditor relates to vehicle purchase. And then if I come in here, I can go into, this is the administrator's workflow email. Now, if we have a look at, won't be a tick, I'll just go into this here. You'll notice with the email we've got workflow, which is where we can selectively, sorry about that, where we can view the record there, and we've also got the ability to approve or reject. So if we rejected this, we can simply click on the reject button. If we click approve, we can simply click on the approve button there. So I'm going to click on approve, and this will log me in. I can also put a comment within here if I want and click the approve button. So you notice that's gone through and it says your approval has been submitted for this workflow setup. Okay, so if we come back in to our, oops, sorry, I think I accidentally shut that down, won't be a tick. Sorry. Okay, so if we come back into GP and we come into the workflow creditor, what we've got there is we're still waiting on approval by Charlie. So if we go into the view history, we've got the final approval has been done by the administrator, but we're still waiting on Charlie's approval. Okay, so that's simply how we can come up with our workflow maintenance when we've got our vendor approval, and we saw that we've got 2 steps to that approval. Now, with regards to a calendar, we've also got on the workflow, when we come back to the original workflow, we've got when task is overdue, and how do we specify when a task is overdue. So each step has a time limit, and that time limit can be applied using the workflow calendar. So if we have a look at the workflow calendar, we've got this here where we can nominate what our work hours are, and we can also nominate our non-work days, so such as public holidays, etc. So if we come back into our workflow maintenance screen, I've illustrated the vendor approval workflow. What I wanted to illustrate now is our payables transaction workflow. So I've set up a simple workflow called AP invoice. And this AP invoice has a step in it that says if the transaction is greater than $1,000, then it needs approval. Okay? So what I'm going to do there, I've also got here the message that's sent. So we'll go through and talk about messages in a moment. But I've also ticked include document attachment documents. So I'll illustrate that in a work example. So if I come to the payables transaction entry window screen and I pick a creditor, and I put a transaction. So remember, the transaction needed to be in excess of $1,000 for the workflow to be activated. I'm just checking I've got some distributions on that. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to attach a document. So hang on, sorry. I'll just put that in a batch called testing. I'll attach a document. And it doesn't matter what document I'm attaching here. I'm just going to attach a PDF on there and go OK. So by clicking on the Submit button here, I can also put a comment that appears in the email, and I've clicked Submit. So by going back to my email, there's my email. So I've been assigned a task. My document's there. Remember, we talked about our attachment. There's my attachment. I can simply click on that and view that document. I can approve, reject or delegate. Now I'm just going to approve this transaction, and I can put a comment on it if that's something that I want to be able to do. So I'll close that down and I'll come back into GP. So if I go back and have a look at that document, there's my document there, and it's been approved. It was approved at 2:20 on today's date, and I can then go in and have a look at the history if that's something that I want to look at. It was over $1,000. It was final approval. Now, in my examples, I've done some very simplistic workflows. So we come back to our workflow maintenance here. And for our AP invoice, we've got over $1,000. We can add additional steps for any workflow. So as I said before, not that one because I've got that activated, but what I'm going to do is come down to the vendor approval that I've got here and add some additional steps within here. So I can go new. Okay, sorry, I can't do that. Let me just add a new workflow within here. So I can create a new workflow here, and I can call it batch approval. And to create steps within each of our workflow, we just keep going through the add additional steps. So depending upon what your requirements are going to depend on how many steps you have. Oops. So some of them can be action is required when the following conditions are met, or the action can always be required for this step. So when we come in here, this is where we put our conditions. So when we're talking about payables batches, this could be where we say, well, the batch header always begins with GJ or something like that. Sometimes we have batches where imported transactions are occurring from other systems, and that might be why we want to workflow those transactions through. Okay. So there's a couple of other things just to talk to with regards to workflow. Oops, sorry. What are the requirements for workflow? So web services is a requirement. So that's something where you need to discuss that with your IT department, because there may be certain certificates required, etc., that require certification for you to be able to use web services. You may also require a different server to enable web services. So that's a technical discussion that your technical department would have with one of our technical consultants. A web client for non-GP users for viewing transactions or documents, that may also be a requirement. So that requires a separate installation. And you may also require additional web user licenses. So that would depend on how many user licenses you've already got, how many people you've got that you wish to do approvals and may wish to log into the web client to look at specific information. Okay, so that concludes a bit of information about workflow and how you can structure workflow within your organisation. Obviously, there's lots of componentry to workflow. I've just touched on vendor approval and a payables invoice approval. There's all those other areas too that you can enable workflow to. So I'll hand it back to Michael now for any questions and answers people might have.
Excellent, thank you, Melita. So we have had some questions come through. There's been a number of questions come through already. So just while we're hitting those questions, if anyone does have any questions they want to ask, please just pop them into the panel on the right-hand side of your screen and we'll try and get to those as quickly as we can. If we're not able to get to all questions or need to take anything offline, we'll happily follow that up and provide that as part of the follow-up and the answers to the email that you get as a follow-up to this session after today. So, Melita, we do have a question here. Are you ready for these?
Yep.
So the first one is, can you attach multiple documents for a workflow?
Yes, you can. So what I'll do is just go back to where I was. So when we keyed a transaction in a moment ago, we'll come back into, oops, what's going on? Sorry, my screen appears to have frozen for a moment, won't be a tick. Oh, that may be why, because I had something open. So when we come into our transaction entry screen here, take for example, this one's already been approved, but when we look at other transactions here, when we come to this attach button here, you've got the ability to attach multiple documents. So can be, I've just tried to attach the same document, but if you notice there, I've just attached another document there. So when that gets workflowed, any of those documents that are attached, they will then be forwarded through for the workflow approval.
Okay, excellent. So we've got another question here, but may be extremely similar and may have already answered it. So, but it's by way of example, so I'll ask the question anyway. So using the vendor approval example, one of the key components that we review is bank details. Is there a way to attach a PDF or document to support review of those details? So I think the answer is yes from an attachment perspective.
Yes, correct. You could attach any scanned document that you wanted to on that in that area.
Okay,
so when we come into the actual workflow here, we've got each step, we've actually got include document, attachment document on a step. So if that's selected, we can then facilitate that.
Okay, excellent. So just a question here then on documentation regarding the workflow. So is there some documentation for setting up workflow? Now obviously I'm not going to name names here on this session, but it sounds like someone wants to have a go at looking at the setup of workflow themselves. So is there
sure.
documentation on this?
There certainly are a couple of manuals. So firstly there's the manual that in regard to workflow setup, but there also is a manual, so they're Microsoft manuals on configuration. So there's the administration side of it, meaning the technical structure, as in web services needs to be installed, etc. So some of those things are held within the manual, where you might need your IT department's assistance.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so there's a couple of questions here now. We may be getting a little bit more technical. So specific example again, if we have few departments, I think that means if we have more than one department with certain limits, and if over those limits, we need to go to senior manager. Is this possible?
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like a multi-stage approval.
No, so basically that would be contained within your, if we're talking about our payables transaction area here, or we could be talking about with purchase order requisitions or something like that. So if I were to create a new workflow here, and I've just called it test, the minute I'll just save that and go into a new step, what you've got is with each of your actions, you've got different abilities to select, so what account's being used. So this is the general ledger distribution account. So if it contains a specific cost centre, you could pull that information in there to restrict. So that would be where the account contains, it might be 200, and also the dollar value amount. So it might be the document amount might be greater than and include, say, $5,000. Does that answer the question that person raised? So what we're looking at is incorporating different steps within a workflow to facilitate the workflow process. So the steps can be quite unique, and nothing may happen if the transaction doesn't fall within those criteria. So if I click OK here, I've got action is required only when the following condition is met. Okay, I still need to assign it to approver, and then I may go through and add additional steps that relate to those approvers.
Okay, excellent. Look, I'm not specifically sure if we've answered that question, but certainly shown there's some flexibility in the way that the workflow can be manipulated and even enabled, so that's excellent. Okay, with regard to purchase order approvals, so sorry, next question, Melita. Purchase order approvals, how many levels, and can this be dependent on who the user is or which department the user works for?
Yet again, I guess it's the same sort of thing. What we're doing here is, I'll just skip this a name. So that step, user must be entered. Sorry. So as with any workflow that you set up, you can have, I haven't come across any documentation that says there's a limit to steps. Obviously, the more steps that you create, you need to be clear on the flow of those steps. So as I just showed you here, I've created a step here. I sure didn't save that properly. But when we come into these here, I've created 2 steps. I could create 100 different steps within that workflow. I just need to think about how I want to create those steps.
Okay, excellent.
So the big thing is the area that you're creating the workflow for is dependent upon what types of actions you can set up. So in my vendor approval, when I have a look at my selection criteria, I'm only seeing creditor information. But when I go into my purchase order processing area, I see different information. I see the creditor ID, I can see dollar values, I can see items, those sorts of things. So it depends on the area that you're looking at workflowing.
So Melita, I can see we've got a number of questions coming through here. From a timing perspective, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. So I'll just pause on the questions for a moment. Please keep the questions coming through, because we will take these questions and follow up individually, and we'll provide a summary there on the answers to some of these questions within your follow-up email that we'll send with some details on the recording today. So the questions are great. Please keep them coming through. and we'll come back to those as part of the follow-up session for today. So as you've seen, workflow is a very popular topic, and it's great to see the stimulate questions coming through there from the audience, which is fantastic, and we will follow up on those. In terms of what to do next with the engagement with a consultant, clearly that is our next step here from a workflow perspective. And part of that engagement is just a clarification on a few things for you in terms of the version of GP that you're running, any additional potential licensing that is required, any prerequisites that are required to actually get that workflow enabled. And then there's the conversation around workflow. So the best thing to do is to book time with a consultant to actually take you through that, and you can contact your account manager to enable that as soon as you're ready. We will, of course, follow up with the attendees on the session today with regard to the next action from a consulting perspective on that workflow as well. Just moving on from now, as a somewhat of an advertisement, we do have a number of events coming up. So with today's event very specifically focused on our GP product and workflow functionality within GP. Here's just a little snapshot of a few more events happening in the next 4 or 5 weeks. We have a SharePoint event coming up, an in-person event in Sydney and Melbourne. We also have a Click event. Now this is the ClickSense product. We've been working with Click for a number of years. That is a webinar, and that's useful for anyone that's looking at a BI product and or someone that already has ClickView but looking to see what else is happening in the Click range with the Sense product. And then staying on the SharePoint Office 365 flavour, we have another event, another seminar on the first week of April there in Sydney and Melbourne, focusing on the Office 365 release. So there are a number of events coming up that are applicable, if not to yourself personally. Please keep looking at our PA events page there, because there are a number of events coming up. And finally, in terms of events or action coming up specifically with our GP product, the GP 2016 product will be released in April from Microsoft, which is not too far away. We will be running a roadshow as we have done in previous years. We did a around the country show for the GP 2013 launch and the GP 2015 launch. So we'd like to do that again, and we'd love you to come along in the relevant city. So we will again do a Perth, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne launch event on the 2016 release. So those dates will come out. It'll be in the April, beginning of May, sometime shortly after the actual release of GP 2016. We'd love to see you there. So just to wrap up, thank you very much for attending today. Thank you, Melita, for taking us through the workflow functionality and answering those questions there on the fly. That was great. Thank you, everyone, for attending. As you leave the webinar today, there will be a short survey come up, and you will be able to let us know your interest in workflow, and we'll happily follow up with you on the back of that response there in the question. So thank you for attending. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you at one of our events in the future. Bye for now.